All right, everybody, I think we can, excuse me, I think we can get started. So it is absolutely a pleasure to introduce Julia Morse, who's a visiting scholar with the Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative at the moment. She is also a fellow on the Council at Foreign Relations and on the faculty of the University of California, Santa Barbara. She has an extraordinarily interesting background that includes stints at the US Department of State, the US mission to the UN, and as an intelligence analyst at the FBI. Her research focuses on international organizations and global governance with a particular focus on issues of monitoring, compliance, and market-driven enforcement. She has published in many top social science journals, wrote an excellent and well-regarded book, The Banker's Blacklist, which focuses on the Financial Action Task Force and explains how it does extraordinary things sometimes in the world. She'll talk today about historical analogies to AI governance. So, Julia, without further ado, the floor is yours.
The microphone's through here, right? So I can move if I need to. Thank you so much for having me. It is really an honor to be here at the Martin School. I have been here since January and have loved my time in Oxford, although people did warn me that I was arriving at the worst time of year. It was extremely cold, but now look at this weather we have, so it's wonderful. So I am a scholar of global governance, and I like to say that at the start because I come to the issue of AI with that background. I'm relatively new to the technical aspects of AI. I've been working on it for about a year. And so I think what I'm hoping to offer here is kind of a broader perspective, drawing on the institutional landscape. What do political scientists know about global governance institutions? And how might we help guide conversations about how to build more global governance? So the motivation for this project, I would say, is twofold. The first is that as someone new to this policy space within the last few years, one of the things that's really struck me is how much thought is being put into the building of global governance institutions. I hate to say this, but this is somewhat unusual in terms of global governance. Often global governance is born out of moments of crisis, where policymakers have to build institutions on a short timeline, and so they're responding to specific challenges. And here there have been a lot of conversations about intentionality. What are the possibilities in terms of global governance? What could it look like? And in the course of those conversations, we see a lot of historical analogies being pulled out. So here we have the OpenAI CEO suggesting that what we need for global governance of AI is something akin to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. This is probably one of the most common analogies that's used in the realm of global governance for AI. We also have the other, I would say, top contender for global governance of AI is an intergovernmental panel on climate change, the IPCC. We need a similar panel on AI. And this is actually something that's being built right now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in the talk. And then more recently, there's been conversations about maybe what Europe needs is a CERN for AI. So the ability to really generate domestic investment in this kind of technology, networking, so that Europe can compete with countries like the United States and China on the AI stage. And so the questions I'm asking in this project are twofold. So one is, why is this a common approach? What are the advantages maybe to relying on historical analogies? Why is this attractive, and why do we see policymakers, pundits, and people in the tech industry alike all trying to pull on these historical analogies? And then the second part is to really think about, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this approach? And so just to give you a sort of overview of my talk, I'm going to start by talking about how historical analogies are used in the context more generally, and then specifically with respect to AI. And then I'll talk about some insights from political science, what I think political science can contribute to this conversation. And finally, I'll conclude with just some brief thoughts about a path forward. Okay, so how are historical analogies used? I'm sure most of you understand what I mean when I say a historical analogy, but I think sometimes it's still useful to start with a definition so that we're all on the same page. So historical analogies are simply claims that two events or phenomena separated by time are similar in essential ways. And they're used really in a variety of contexts. So media coverage, news articles love to bring up these kinds of comparisons. Oh, what we're seeing in this context is another, insert the blank, right? Another event similar to this, another Munich. The Munich analogy comes up a lot, and I will talk about that. They're used in the context of foreign policy. So foreign policy makers use them. They use them in talking to domestic audiences to set the context for how we should think about this. And they're used in the context of debates and social commentary. And the reason they're used is because they offer a kind of shorthand way of understanding really complex phenomenon. So you can imagine that if I wrote a policy paper that's 50 pages describing what I think global governance for AI should look like, and I'm trying to talk to someone about my paper, it's going to be very hard to describe that in a few sentences. But if I tell someone what I want, what we need is an IAEA for AI. Instantly, they have a framework for understanding what my paper is about. One of the things that I think often gets missed in these conversations is that because they are these shorthand ways of understanding complex phenomenon, they also transmit normative content across contexts. So if I want you to take AI really seriously, and I say what we need is an IAEA for AI, instantly you think nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are serious. Okay, I need to take this very seriously. This is an institution that's one of the strongest global governance bodies we have. And so that tells you something about kind of the policy implications. Alternatively, if maybe I don't want the strongest global governance regime, I might cite the IPCC. I might say what we just need is a scientific body to provide some assessments. And this again sends kind of a different normative content. And policymakers are very aware of the way in which these kinds of normative contents are relevant to historical analogies. So just to give you an example of this, historical analogies are frequently used in the context of war. I'm sure many of you have heard throughout history comparisons basically since the 1970s to the Vietnam War. So one familiar example of this came up in the context of the Iraq War. When it started to be clear that Iraq was not going as planned, George W. Bush was repeatedly asked about parallels between Iraq and Vietnam. And what he said in 2004 when asked about this is, I think the analogy is false. I also happen to think the analogy sends the wrong message to our troops and the wrong message to the enemy. Right? So it wasn't just that he didn't want the analogy. He understood that if you accept the analogy that Iraq is similar to Vietnam, you're instantly accepting all of the associations of Vietnam, a conflict that draws on for many years, a conflict that the United States can't win and eventually pulls out of in defeat, right? And so he really didn't want that kind of association. Some of the seminal work on historical analogies comes from a book called Analogies at War by Professor Kong. And this book actually goes back. It was first published in the 1990s, but is still cited a lot today because the analysis is so insightful. And he actually talks about the analogies that influenced the decision to go into Vietnam War. Specifically, in the context of Korea, the analogy thinking about the potential consequences of communist expansion. Okay, if we don't stop communism in Korea, they could see kind of what had happened. There was a need then to intervene. The analogy of the Munich Pact, right? The dangers of appeasement. This is frequently used. And then the analogy of Dien Bien Phu, which was a massive loss for the French and ultimately led to them pulling out. And this was an analogy that they learned, okay, this is a symbol of weak commitment to an ally. So all of these influenced policymaking related to Vietnam. And what he says in the context of this book is that analogies are often deployed by policymakers without really thought about context. And as a result, they're used to simplify something that is very complex. And so this can be problematic, of course, in terms of decision making. So you might also be familiar with analogies in the context of the Russia and Ukraine war. So almost instantly, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2002, or excuse me, in 2022, there were parallels drawn to Munich. We have to stand strong. We cannot allow the Russians to do this. This will be similar to the Munich Pact. If we appease them, it'll just lead to them taking more territory. And as the war has gone on longer, people have said, well, is Munich the right analogy? Are there other analogies we should be drawing on? And people have also said, maybe we don't need to just look at historical analogies. Maybe this is its own complicated conflict, and pulling on these historical analogies maybe limits the way we think about things. In the context of AI, the kind of analogies we see, I think, draw from two kinds of approaches. The first is people thinking about parallel technologies. I think all of us can agree that AI has the potential to drastically transform nearly every aspect of life, right? This is a potentially groundbreaking technology. And so some people say, what are other breakthrough technologies that we might look at? And here, that's how we often end up at nuclear weapons, right? At least political scientists will tell you few technologies have transformed the way countries conduct warfare the way that nuclear weapons have. They have led to, a century, or since 1945, essentially the absence of great power conflict, war between the great powers. Some people say this has led to stability. There's a number of theories related to nuclear weapons. And so people say, well, maybe we look at what governs nuclear weapons. This is a way to source of analogies. The other kind of technological-based approach to historical analogies that we see is looking for technologies that also have significant private sector involvement. So the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, is commonly used as a historical analogy for maybe we can draw on this organization for AI, because of course countries are setting rules, but ultimately those rules and standards are governing the private sector. And we know for AI that private sector participation is crucial for any kind of governance scheme. The other kind of approach is to think about it from a cooperation challenge perspective. Okay, what are other high-profile challenges? And here we end up frequently on looking to climate change and the process that exists around climate change, because that is, for many of us, the international challenge that is first and foremost. There have been others who have said, well, maybe we need to think about other kinds of challenges that are cross-border in nature, things like global finance, where you really need participation from everyone to be able to regulate what's happening in one state. So I want to talk really briefly through the IAEA analogy and the IPCC analogy to explain why these are attractive, and then also why we might view them with some skepticism. In the case of the IAEA analogy, we can see obvious reasons why this is really an attractive analogy. One, the technology is transformative. AI and nuclear technologies, it's hard to kind of come up with a list of other technologies that are on the same scale as these. Two, both technologies are what's called dual use in political science, which means they have military applications potentially, but also a lot of civilian applications. So there's obvious parallels on this respect. A third way that there are parallels between nuclear technology and AI are that the technologies are really concentrated in a handful of states, right? So in nuclear weapons, there's only a small number of countries that actually possess nuclear weapons technologies. In AI right now, there's 2 countries that possess the preponderance of AI technology and control, right? And then there's a handful of other countries that are in sort of the same kind of arena and neighborhood, and then there's a huge gap. So for all of these reasons, people think, well, maybe the IAEA is a good analogy. I just want to draw attention to 2 kinds of reasons why we might be a little bit skeptical of the IAEA analogy. So the first is there are major differences in who controls the technology. In the case of the IAEA, you're able to set up a strong institution on nuclear weapons because that technology is held by governments. But in the context of AI, even if governments worked together and created such an agreement, they would still have to monitor what the private sector is doing. It's a completely different kind of cooperation challenge. The second difference that I think often gets overlooked is the political climate. So one of the things that is very well documented in political science is that right after the Second World War, there was a huge growth of global governance institutions. This is kind of the golden moment of cooperation. A lot of the institutions that you know today, things like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, these are really born out of the momentum. The IMF are born out of the momentum of 1945 in this post-war moment. And that momentum continues for maybe 20 years, but gradually declines over time. Today, we have, in many developed countries, increased skepticism of formal multilateral cooperation, right? We all have witnessed kind of the rise of anti-globalism, of populist sentiment, and that has carried over into policymakers. Even policymakers who might support the liberal international order as it exists to now are not generally interested in building really strong global governance institutions. So the political climate for this kind of institution is quite different than it was at the time the IAEA was created in the 1950s. On the IPCC analogy, we can also see why this is an attractive analogy. Climate change is one of the most pressing problems of our time. And there's been a lot of political attention. It involves commitments from industry and from the private sector. From industry and from government and from civil society actors. So it's really a multi-stakeholder process. And there was a need for information the way there is also a need for information on AI. However, there's two things that I would just highlight as differences. The first is a major difference in policy speed. So the IPCC takes 5 years to produce a report. 5 years. In the context of AI, 5 years is many, many lifetimes, right? An AI panel that produced a report every 5 years would essentially have no value to policymakers. The other thing that I would highlight is what I would call a difference in underlying uncertainty. So in the case of climate change, the initial mandate of the IPCC was really to kind of determine to what extent was the planet warming and to what extent were humans causing that warming. These are two, I think most of us would agree, empirical facts, right? You can uncover them with data. The kind of uncertainty that exists on AI is much more complex, right? What does a risky model look like? What does a safe model look like? How do we set up parameters around this? How can AI be deployed for things like the Sustainable Development Goals? These are all things that are under consideration for such a panel. And these are, I would say, further from kind of an empirical, precise truth that are trying to be uncovered. So that makes it an independent scientific panel, the work of such a panel, a little bit more complex. Okay, so now I'd like to turn to talking a little bit about what political science can imply and kind of how it can help us make sense of the use of historical analogies. So here, bear with me, I'm taking you back to your undergraduate classes and giving you a very quick 30-second lecture on how political scientists think about global governance institutions. So there's 3 kinds of insights I would say political science brings to the study of global governance bodies. The first is that they are designed to solve specific kinds of cooperation problems. And so the institutional design features reflect the specific cooperation problem that they're related to. The second is that they reflect the incentive structures of states, and in particular, the expectation or lack of expectation that states are likely to try and cheat. And the third is that they reflect the political climate of the moment. And I'm going to talk through each of these points. Okay, so one of the main insights from political science is that when you create an institution, you can really only understand a global governance body by understanding what it's intended to solve. Some kinds of global governance bodies are oriented around information, right? These are things like the IPCC. The problem is that we don't know what's happening. There's a lack of consensus on this issue. And so countries need to work together to figure out what does the truth look like. Other kinds of cooperation problems are really about communication and networking. So here we can think about transnational regulatory networks, things like the Basel Agreement, agreements between bankers, right? What they need is to get together and coordinate policy and have pathways to talk to each other if a crisis arises. And a third kind of cooperation problem is the kind of cooperation problem where rules are fine, but there has to be some kind of compliance procedure. And here we're talking about something like the IAEA, right? It's not meaningful to set up a nuclear non-proliferation treaty if there's no one to monitor it, because countries will break the rules. So these are, many institutions overlap in terms of what they do, but these are all different kinds of approaches that suggest different kinds of institutional design. The second insight is that institutions are going to really reflect the degree to which you expect people to break the rules. So one of the things I would say about how political scientists approach global governance is that they are always skeptical about the rules, right? We always expect that people are going to try and break the rules. We expect that you will get things like cosmetic compliance, right? Which is that I pretend like I'm complying on the surface, but underneath I'm doing what I want. And so what we ask, okay, well, what are the actual incentives for governments or non-state actors to follow the rules? And if they're going to ask countries to do things that are costly, there's going to be higher incentives to lie. And so in that case, if I want a regime to function effectively, I need it to have strong monitoring or enforcement. So these things are all related to each other. The final insight is that institutions are going to reflect particular political climates and moments in time. So I became interested in global governance because I was interested in studying international cooperation to combat terrorism. There was a ton of international cooperation to combat terrorism after 9/11. And that was in part because there was a lot of political will. At the time 9/11 happened, in that immediate aftermath, that first year, countries around the world were all concerned about terrorism, they all felt targeted, and they were willing to work together to solve the problem. So political will can shift quickly, as in the case of an exogenous event like 9/11, but the institutions that you get will definitely be results of that kind of political moment and who is interested and invested in a particular policy issue. So I want to apply this to an AI governance effort that is currently underway, which is that they are actually building an AI panel right now. In September 2024, the UN Global Digital Compact requested that states establish an independent international scientific panel on AI. And that was about all it said. It did not specify what this panel would look like, what it would do. It just said that they were going to build one. So negotiations started in January, and then in March, the co-facilitators put out a zero draft that proposes the panel would provide multidisciplinary, independent, and evidence-based scientific assessments of the opportunities, risks, capabilities, and impacts of AI. So this is kind of where we are now. Countries are in the process of negotiating this panel. So if we want to think about, this panel is obviously modeled on the IPCC. And so I think it's useful to think about, okay, where is this analogy useful and where might this panel be a little different? From an information standpoint or cooperation goal standpoint, these panels are obviously somewhat similar, right? They are both designed to produce scientific assessments, thinking through complex problems. And in the IPCC case, the reports are designed to be neutral, policy relevant, but not prescriptive. We don't know that this will happen with the AI panel, but I think it's likely that that's where we'll end up. I would highlight, however, on information, there is this difference where if you think about what is happening here, assessments on climate change, right? Yes, implications and potential future risks, these are a little bit more contentious. But here, assessments on opportunities, risks, capabilities, and impacts of AI, that's a huge, huge area. And I think no one is really sure what that means, right? And so right now, there's a lot of thought being put into what would a panel look like on this. And I would note that this, I think, is one kind of difference between the two approaches. The second thing that I think makes this analogy maybe a little bit trickier is related to the divergent costs of obtaining the information. In the case of the IPCC, the best information about climate change comes from peer-reviewed academic articles and visual assessments of the planet, right? So these are all things that are available to scientists. As we talked about, there's a 5-year cycle, which is a good way of accounting for the slow pace of academic research. This is going to be very different in the AI context. So first, the best information about AI capabilities and risks sits within industry, right? But you don't necessarily want industry on the scientific panel. Right now, this is a subject of debate. Well, what will be the role of industry? But obviously, a scientific panel generally has scientists who have kind of neutral reputations. So how will they square this circle? You can't completely exclude industry if they have the best information, but industry may have proprietary reasons they don't want to share information, right? They could have very valuable logical concerns about sharing such an information with the panel. And so there's a question of how this panel is going to get their information, and will they really be able to tap into providing information the way the IPCC does? Governments might have some knowledge, but again, will they want to share necessarily what they know about with this knowledge with the panel, right? This is to be determined. And finally, published peer review academic sources can be quickly out of date. The academic cycle just takes longer than the speed of change in AI. So this is one of the ways in which this analogy kind of leaves significant gaps. Another way that I think is kind of more mixed is looking at the politics of this issue. The IPCC and in the context of AI panel, there are divides in terms of thinking about responsibility for climate change, funding, and technology. In the context of the AI panel, there's kind of a developed country divide about, are we thinking about risks or are we thinking about opportunities of AI technology, right? There's just a disagreement among countries. It's not purely on developing versus developed countries, but countries disagree about what's the most important thing to prioritize. And then as we talked about, the time horizon is quite different, right? In the context of the IPCC, the panel is 5 years. That's a very long, slow cycle, and that can't be the case, right? In the context of an AI panel, if it's not producing reports at least once a year, it's questionable what the value will be. Okay, so what would a path forward then look like? I think that often the misuse of these analogies comes from people just ignoring different parts of the picture, right? So if we think back to the IPCC analogy, we think, oh, we have a lot of confusion about what AI is, what risks and opportunities are. So let's look at the IPCC, right? Similar confusion about climate change. And that's one part of the picture, but it's only one part of the picture. And so I would say in general, when these analogies come out, things like red teaming the analogy, which is asking where it might not be right, or identifying what the underlying ideological assumptions are, or considering alternative analogies can be really valuable. In terms of a more systematic approach, something like starting with the cooperation challenge, I think is really valuable, right? So when we talk about AI governance, we're actually talking about many, many, many different kinds of things, right? So what is the core cooperation problem? Is it a problem where we need networks built between the AI safety institutes, right? Is it a problem where we need information about what's really happening in terms of AI risks? Is it a problem where we want industry to commit to transparent standards and monitoring? Is it a problem where we want insight into cloud computing clusters, right? There's many different ways we could think about what the problem is, and each of those kinds of problems will necessitate a different kind of solution. The second thing is, once you think about a problem, is to think about what other kinds of institutions tackle similar challenges. So if we're building a network, let's look at the literature on regulatory networks, right? That's the right place where we can draw on the right kind of analogy. The third is to say, okay, let's also think about uncooperative behavior, right? We all have to put on kind of our skeptic's hat and say, okay, we can create the rules, but that doesn't mean people will follow them. Right? So what does the incentive structure look like? And can we make sure that we try and build into the regime incentives to make sure people follow the rules? And that could be carrots or sticks. And then finally, thinking about global governance schemes and the politics of the issue, right? What are the related politics of something as it relates to this kind of challenge? Finally, I think that as we're using existing analogies that are already out there, because there is a lot of really thoughtful work on this issue, in having conversations about these, it might be just asking these kinds of questions, which is considering how the context is similar or different from this historical analogy versus what we're thinking about in AI, and being transparent about the differences, and considering alternative options. So just in conclusion, I think historical analogies are very helpful. If we return to that example of me writing a 50-page paper and trying to explain it to a policymaker, that is very difficult, right? There are reasons why I might say, this is a cross between the IAEA and the IPCC, and I'm merging it in this way. But I think when we do that, we need to be thoughtful about considering differences in cooperation problems, costs, and politics, and also recognizing that whatever analogy we choose will ultimately have an ideological underpinning, right? And so when someone gives us an analogy, there is some amount of skepticism, I would say, that we should employ in thinking, okay, well, what does this imply, right? And is this the kind of worldview of AI or worldview of a policy issue that maybe aligns with what we think, or could this be out there for other kinds of reasons? So thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Up there. Great. Thanks so much, Julia. So we'll have a bit of a discussion here on the panel, and very shortly open up the floor to all of you. And I'll just note that this is being recorded, so when you ask a question, know that it is a little bit for posterity. We are very fortunate today to have a leading scholar of AI governance who just happened to be coming through Oxford, Gillian Hatfield. And so she'll offer a few remarks, and I will not say very much about her background, although one could say really a great deal about her background. But she is an economist and legal scholar turned AI researcher. She is a Schmidt Sciences AI 2050 Senior Fellow, which is a significant honor. And she is professor of government at Johns Hopkins University, as well as research professor in computer science. Gillian.
Great. All right. Thanks, Robert. And Julia, thank you for a terrific talk. And I also want to welcome you to the small but hardy band of social scientists working in the area of AI. Sort of made that transition myself about 8 years ago. And one of my main means of proselytizing is to say we need many more social scientists thinking about this transformative technology and really raising our game on a lot of topics. And I think you've just given us a fantastic example of bringing the expertise on what does global governance really look like. And when people I hear this as well, both on the global but also on the domestic. Oh, we need an FDA for AI. I say, well, let's be very careful about what we mean by that. So I want to just really emphasize the importance of this, and I know we probably have a number of social scientists in the room here. So go. There's lots of work to be done, and I think this focus on analogies is a really important one, because the reason that we need significant participation of the expertise of social scientists here is currently almost all of the work that's being done to basically redesign the world is being done by computer scientists. And I love computer scientists. Married to them, both kids are co-authors. I'm actually now a computer scientist myself. So it's fantastic. But computer scientists are really good at what they do, and we're good at what we do. And I think that expertise is needed. So, for example, there's some of you would be following perhaps sort of recent discussions of whether AI is just a normal technology. Is it something that is just, so don't worry about it. Companies are not going to roll out stuff that's dangerous, because that's not the way companies work. And market, we won't see rapid deployment because, hey, look at how long it took for transformations with electricity and other technologies. So those kinds of analogies, many of which are invoking important considerations, but I think not with the sophistication we're looking for in terms of how do markets work, how do organizations, how do corporations work. So again, I want to just really emphasize the importance here of thinking structurally about this. Now, I think one of the things that we see, and Julia, you brought this out very nicely as well, is that our conversations tend to be about the idea that AI is a thing, I mean, and maybe as you pointed out, nuclear technology is more than one thing, but it's much more a defined thing than AI, right? AI is so fundamentally transformative. It's changing how we do almost everything, has the capacity to change how we do almost everything. So the idea that we are talking about, well, how are we going to govern AI, is I think something that comes from our sort of, we start looking at how we do governance, we say, oh, actually, we need to know there's specific things we govern. And even when we're thinking about climate change, there's a lot of different dimensions of what that involves. So I think one of the things that the analogies of we do need to look at the existing institutions. And what I really liked when you got into the idea of thinking, okay, now let's think theoretically. Like analogies can be great for the reasons that you bring out. It's a quick way of summarizing what you're thinking about, but it also tends to both shut down our more careful theoretical thinking and actually gets us setting up whole processes like you bring out with sort of the UN panel. Says, oh, well, here's how we do this. And we stop actually thinking very in fundamental theoretical ways about the nature of the problem we're dealing with. So I really wanted to draw out as well your observation about thinking about that theoretical question of institutional design. Well, what kinds of problems are we trying to solve with what kinds of institutions? What are the attributes of different institutions? And I think this is something we also need to be doing much more extensively. One of the things that Robert and I have been working on, for example, has been participating in a set of dialogues, the international dialogues on AI safety with Western and Chinese academics primarily here. And one of the things I think that's made that successful is, or at least we hope it's going to be successful, I think it's been fruitful, is a way of saying, let's focus in particular on specific risks for which we think we need currently global governance. And so we've made statements, for example, about red lines and the types of things we think we could get global agreement and therefore potentially global cooperation on. Let's just say we're not going to have systems that are recursively self-improving, right? And let's figure out what those red lines are and sort of work from there. And one of the things that I think we need to be thinking about a lot in this context, and I don't know, you be the expert here about whether or not this informs any of our global governance institutions now, but the fact of the matter is we don't know how to regulate AI. We do not know what we should be doing in all kinds of domains. Even if we say we want to draw those red lines, well, we don't exactly know what we're supposed to look at or what they how we'd carry that. So we need learning systems. We need regulatory evolution systems. We need to be designing institutions with a view not to how are we solving this cooperation problem today, but rather how are we starting to build the institutions that can adapt and respond as we learn more. I'll take another minute or two. Is that good? Okay. So I think the other thing, and again, Julia brought it out nicely. AI is a general purpose technology. And I think there are ways, and this is also why I think the normal technology point kind of gets my goat a little bit, is to say, well, there's a lot that's very unique about what's happening in AI. And therefore, things that we won't have easy analogies or even maybe helpful analogies for how we should think about governance. AI is operating at scale and speed that we just haven't seen before and has this capacity for tremendous autonomy. So we're not, sometimes they will say, look, we're not just building a technology, we're building new actors in the market, in society. So that's a very different type of problem than we've seen before. You also emphasize, I think this is really critical. You would actually be better at helping me understand whether I'm getting out over my skis here to say, I think this is the first time we've had such a massively consequential technology that's built entirely inside private companies, protected by the artificial legal boundary we create around corporations for lots of good reasons that we've created that type of institution. And we don't have the capacity to use public domain science to evaluate, to test. So just like you were emphasizing, Julia, how are we going to figure out what the risks are and what our different regulatory techniques might look like if we can't, as academics, as public sector researchers, as regulators, policymakers, we can't actually get in there and poke. We can't do crash tests. We can't reverse engineer, right? We can't reproduce in the academic lab what's happening in the, and I think this puts us in a very, very different setting. The other is, again, because of the general purpose technology nature of this, the dimensions of commercial competition, global competition, right? That is such a huge driver on this. And again, I'm sure that there's some of that in some of the other technologies. Certainly all our climate change work, there's lots of markets invoked. But I think it's the clearly what we're seeing in terms of whatever efforts we might get in place for starting to get governance structures, whether it's domestically or globally, heavily influenced, and even more influenced today than it was even a year ago, by discourse around commercial competitiveness, innovation, and we want to be a first. We want to be ahead. We need to be ahead to build those markets. So I'll just maybe wrap up with to say one of the things I think that I would like to see more of in the global governance conversation, that I think the analogies maybe don't, well, maybe there are analogies we could use here, and I need to know more about these institutions, is we've tended to focus very much on the substantive policy question. What do we want, right? What does it mean to have fair algorithms? What does it mean to have safe technologies? We don't want bioweapons and so on. And what we don't pay attention to are the infrastructural questions, right? The totally taken for granted fact that we have all kinds of domestic and global registration schemes. So you mentioned a little bit about sort of international banking and finance regulation. There's a ton of infrastructure that's created there that gives us handholds for regulating. So, and I think that's also something we might have greater success at building global institutions that are saying, okay, we're going to register, okay, if 2025 is the year of AI agents, and I'm not sure this is going to happen, but companies are telling us we're going to have millions, hundreds of millions of agents participating in markets, engaging in transactions. I'm saying, holy cow, where's the ID for an AI agent? How do I look it up? How do I sue on behalf? How do I figure out if everybody's very sure that humans are going to be the ones ultimately responsible? How do I figure out who those humans are? I think we may actually be able to get more global cooperation on building some of that infrastructure that's going to give us the capacity for regulation later. So thanks again, Julia. Great talk.
Great. Thank you so much, Jillian. And I think we have time now to open up the floor. And while people are thinking about questions, maybe I'll just ask the first one. And that is, I guess I can't resist asking you about some of your past work. So Julia's known a bit for doing work in soft law, what's sometimes called soft law. And that seems to be very interesting in the context of AI governance, because I think, and as you alluded to in your talk, it might be quite difficult to get sort of hard law at the international level. And yet we want to figure out ways of setting incentives for actors to comply with international standards at the international level. So I'm curious if you see soft law approaches as a way to square that circle.
Is the protocol that I answer directly, or do you collect?
I think we can just do answering directly now because we have a little bit of time, but maybe at the end we'll do some collecting.
Okay, fabulous. So my book is on the Financial Action Task Force, which is an intergovernmental body that regulates illicit financing. So, and all of you are familiar with the effect of the FATF, even if you've never heard of it, because if you go to open a bank account and they ask you for verification of who you are, or you try and send money abroad, all of these procedures in every country in the world are affected by the FATF standards. And so I study that institution because it's one of the institutions that's actually had a really profound impact on the world. It's among us IO scholars, an unusual example of effectiveness. And so that's really why I came to it. And I do think there are a lot of lessons that can be pulled from it. because it is kind of this soft law scheme and was set up not through a formal treaty, but through kind of cooperation of bureaucrats at different countries. So regulators at the Treasury, finance ministries, basically working together to set standards, regulate their own banking sectors, and then make sure that all of the countries kind of in the world have these kind of systems in place. So you can imagine for AI, a world where we have governments willing to regulate in some aspect of the technology sector. And then I think to Jillian's point about the infrastructure that needs to be built, right? That's a huge component of it. So one of the things that exists in finance was that they set up all of these rules about banks have to monitor illicit financing, right? They have to make sure that there's not money launderers and terrorists using their financial system. They set up all of these rules, and as I'm sure will surprise no one, until they started enforcing those rules, banks were not really doing this. They were not taking it super seriously. It was not until they started to be faced with fines in the United States and then several other jurisdictions that it really became clear that they had to actually put in place strong compliance procedures and take these things really seriously. And they had to essentially shift the incentives of private sector actors. So I would say, for me, the analogy is useful both in kind of two kinds of ways. One, in suggesting that you can create governance outside of the private sector, outside of sort of formal treaty institutions. And actually most of the governance we've seen in the last 30 years is of that kind, this soft law governance. But the other is suggesting that creating governance itself is not going to be enough unless you do something to ensure that there are incentives for companies to meet what you set up. Now, those things don't have to be done at the same time, I would say. Sometimes you create the rules first and everybody can get on board, and then they don't advocate against the rules too harshly, and then you follow it up with an enforcement scheme, and it's easier at that point. Strategically, that might make sense. But I do think it's important. Sometimes people think, oh, well, we just got to create the rules. But, rules without any kind of shifting of incentives, when we're talking about profit-driven companies, right, they're going to do what is in their best interest, right? And they're making calculations about these.
Yep. Thanks a lot. All right, so I think we'll open it up, and I saw a hand. Yep.
Yeah, thanks. So what do you talked a little bit about the UN, but you also talked about how the UN is or the climate for international cooperation like that has changed. Could you talk a little bit about, whether you think that the UN is as powerful today, and from which side this kind of effort that you've talked about in relation to AI is being challenged? And on the other side, you didn't mention the EU very much. And do you see the EU as kind of regulating or governing AI in respect to a very specific, much more narrow mandate or purview than what's going on with the UN? Do you see it as being irrelevant, perhaps? Or do you see that effort as having some kind of purchase on the questions that you raised?
Sure. So let me start with the EU question, actually. So, as I said, a lot of what we've seen cooperation-wise in the last 30 years has been on soft law. And the EU has had this really interesting effect on those kind of on global regulations, which is that when the EU sets regulations, they can sometimes shift the norm of regulations for the world. And I would say maybe a year ago, with the EU AI Act, that's what I maybe thought was going to happen. But of course, I didn't anticipate the 2024 election, and we're now in a kind of different world than the space where we were. And so I think now the EU, I think, is faced with a much kind of different challenge, where they moved quickly to try and regulate AI in a way that when there is still a lot of unknowns, and I think they're still kind of struggling to figure out how exactly does this law get interpreted and implemented. And so that means, I would say, the effect of that specific regulation on the larger context of AI is a little bit unknown right now, and I think it kind of depends. But traditionally, historically, the EU, because it is a big market and a big player, EU regulation has had a big effect on kind of what global standards end up being. In terms of the UN, it's interesting. I guess, is the UN, one of the things that scholars of global governance like to talk about is, the shift from formal governance to informal governance. And there's a kind of hand-wringing. Are we witnessing the decline of global governance, or is it just a shift? Are we seeing new kinds of cooperation that maybe are more effective? And there's all these conversations about it. Certainly the UN of today is not the UN of, say, the 1990s. I think that's clear. And that was maybe a point where post-Cold War, there was a lot of emphasis and hope on sort of formal cooperation. And I would say over the last 20 years, 25 years, it's really shifted a lot more towards this kind of regulatory bodies. And so the UN is still important because it is one of the only really inclusive forums. And for something like AI that's so widespread, right? Every country in the world can be impacted by this. And as I mentioned, a lot of developing countries in particular see this technology as something that could provide huge gains. But I think, I would say among the sort of Western countries, there is an increased skepticism of the UN and more interest in using informal governance and sort of alternative forums for pushing through cooperation. And so it's kind of could go either way.
Yep.
Thank you all for this. I want to ask a question about where to start in terms of grounding this. So, and also picking up on something that Robert talked about and you spoke about before, which is this idea of soft law and I guess what I would call low-hanging fruit. So you spoke about how after 9/11, we had cooperation on terrorism. After the rise of ISIS, we again had cooperation on TVEC and GIFCT was set up. And then, of course, the Christchurch call as well. When we look at these kind of near-term harms today, the trouble is, even if we do really extensive red teaming and evals on Western models, I can go and create those same harms on a model in China, and yet we have competition between the US and China. And so what I wonder is, even if we don't get to full cooperation on AI alignment and sort of existential risks, can we start with these kind of near-term harms like criminal misuse, terrorist and violent extremist misuse, and does that provide sort of a stepping stone to later, more robust cooperation?
Yeah, thank you for raising this. I think one of the things that's often missed is how much global governance evolves over time, right? So absolutely, I think if you asked me, is it better to have something than nothing? I would say almost always, not always, but almost always, yes. And so if the low-hanging fruit is we can all agree we don't want terrorists to get these, or we don't want people to use AI systems to create bioweapons, or we can all agree that we don't, there are certain principles that I do think are widely shared, and creating kind of cooperation and standards and around those things I think that is a path forward that people are actively working on, and that is maybe the best option. And you can always then expand as new challenges. One of the things about that institution I described, the Financial Action Task Force, is until 2001, it just dealt with money laundering. And then when 9/11 happened, the Bush administration said, where can we put terrorist financing? Look, we have this institution. We can naturally, there was an institution ready to take on that challenge, and the infrastructure already existed that they could tackle it onto. And so starting to build those institutions in whatever form they are gives pathways, I think, down the road as other threats emerge.
Great. Maybe on this side of the room over there.
Well, the thing is, it's related to the other two people that asked questions. What do we do when we have a situation whereby one of the leading players, the US, has a president who doesn't believe in global cooperation, doesn't believe in climate change, and what do we do in terms of what you're talking about? How can we mitigate the fact that you have somebody who, doesn't, is in a position where it's a very powerful country as far as AI is concerned, but will not be very helpful as far as developing the kind of cooperation you're talking about?
I mean, I think this is a very important question, and I think this is a question that people are actively grappling with right now. I will say that I think on AI, certain aspects of AI, I think there is, maybe more room for cooperation even among an administration that actively is not generally supportive of multilateralism. But I think that, the answer is basically that you have to proceed along like-minded groups, right? That, maybe, well, I would say there's two paths you could take. One is to try and create the strongest, the way the rules should be, and just create them without the US and hope the US joins later. I'd say that has potential downsides, right? Because the US controls so much technology. And so I think what countries who are interested in this are trying to figure out is, are there those things, right? Terrorism, bioweapons, are there some kinds of threats that the US could maybe see value in cooperating on, even if maybe they would never sign an international treaty? And the sort of United States skepticism towards treaties is not just it's not just a Trump thing, right? This is going back many years now, that the US just generally doesn't want to sign. I mean, we haven't signed the Convention on the Law of the Sea, even though the US Navy supports it, or ratified it rather. So I think there are these attempts to try and find, well, what are the areas, and can we do it through more informal kinds of governance schemes? And maybe there's some path forward, but I mean, that's really the political reality of this moment. The other thing that some people are doing is just saying, okay, can we think about policy solutions for either when the US has a different government or when a crisis strikes, right? Can we be ready if there is the equivalent of the 9/11 in the AI space, where countries are scrambling and saying, we need to build something right now? And so there's some thought being put into, like, okay, well, what kind of solutions could be ready-made for policymakers to pull on then?
So I think maybe we'll collect the last three questions and then ask both panelists if they'd like to respond to them. So yeah, I think we have three hands here.
Thank you so much. I have a follow-up question on your response to the low-hanging fruit question, and in regards to AI being a general purpose technology. I wonder if then, rather than having one specific overarching institution on AI governance, whether it makes more sense to then diffuse it in terms of the specific areas. So having having the counterterrorism network deal with AI and terrorism, having the financial action network deal with AI and financial sector, or the World Health Organization. So having the existing infrastructural setup on specific areas that AI are touching upon, rather than having an overarching AI institution that, as you said, is just very uncertain, very huge, and will have different cooperation issues in terms of priorities, etc. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And actually, maybe we'll just take one last question, because I know we're running short on time. There's one right there or here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm wondering whether we've already seen what with Spain and Portugal, the implications of what happens when there's a crisis, because without power, there is no AI.
Yes, okay. Great. So let me turn to both panelists, and if there are things that you want to reflect on generally, please.
Sure. So I'm just going to pick up on the general purpose technology point and say I do think that we need to be shifting from. There are some things we need to regulate at the AI level. Like I do think there are things like the AI, red lines and so on. But so much of this is how is it transforming our other existing regulatory challenges. So the financial institution one, I just think that's something we could build on right now. another one, and it's in response to the observation, what do you do when the U.S. doesn't want to participate in global multilateral governance? And one of the analogies I don't hear mentioned here, structures, is the WTO. Now, it's a very weird time to be talking about trade, but you know, countries can be saying, we will only allow these kinds of technologies into our markets. And I think there's a lot of ways in which the rest of the world can have an impact on the U.S. where most of these companies are, by saying, look, if you haven't done the following kinds of tests, if you haven't passed the following kinds of red teaming tests, if you haven't got the following characteristics in your technology, you can't access our market with the chatbots or the embedded AI or the autonomous vehicles and so on. So I think there are mechanisms here. And again, it's an organic approach on global governance, but I think there's a way for it to be on the pull side rather than the push side, I guess.
So just picking up on that point, I 100% agree. I think, and I also think the one thing the Trump administration has said clearly about AI is that they're for innovation and market forces. And so if something can be sold to them as related to market innovation, if they understand any kind of sort of governance in that context, and that could be based on regulation in other states, then that is a sort of compelling speaking point. On the piecemeal approach, yeah, I think there's a need for certain issues really can only be addressed through a kind of international governance scheme focused on AI. But for sure, there's a lot of other issues that can be focused on the issue level. And I will say, I think you will increasingly see that in the counterterrorism realm. Everybody who could possibly put counterterrorism in their mission after 9/11 did, because there's resources available, right? Similarly, increasingly, you will see attention to AI from any organization that might touch on it, both because it's important and because, right, there's resources available for those kinds of things. So it's strategic for people to talk about AI. So maybe that's some kind of progress in that way.
Great. One thing actually that Julia didn't mention is that she is intimately involved with a proposal now before the UN of how institutionally to structure this new scientific panel and IPCC for AI, and speaking now to staff at the UN and also to country representatives who are most involved in shaping these policies. So I think we were lucky today to hear insights that were both theoretical, but also really very much practically informed. So please join me in thanking both of our panelists.